Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to continue working on the first-person controller for my new game. In the last video, I added additional inputs, and I added the ability to fly, or at least move up and down vertically. In this video, I'm going to work on the look controls so it behaves the way I want it to for my game. Now currently, if I hit play, you can see that the first-person controller from the low poly shooter pack behaves the way you expect a first-person controller to behave. So I can look left to right in 360 degrees, but if I try to look up and down, there's actually a limit on how far my character can rotate, which is how you would expect a standard first-person controller to behave. But if I'm giving my character the ability to fly, then it actually feels very rigid to have a standard first-person controller. And so I'm going to fix that. And so the first thing I want to look at is how the different rotation axes are affecting different objects of the player. And so the first thing that I notice is that when I move the mouse from left to right, the entire prefab is what's rotating on the y-axis. But then when I move the mouse up and down, it's actually the first child to the prefab, or this default root object, that is rotating on the x-axis. And we can see that it's on this object that there is a camera look script. So I'm going to stop my project. And so I'm actually going to first look at the player input component, and I'm going to find the look callback function. For this function, we can see that it's calling the onLook function inside the character script. And so here inside the character script, there is the onLook function. And inside this function, once again, it's just reading the player's input and saving it into this variable. And so now I'm going to look at all the references for this variable. And at the top of the character class, you can see here we have the override function for getLookInput, where it's returning the same variable. And so now I'm going to look at all the references for this get function. And so inside this late update function, we can see that the code is getting the player's look input, or in other words, their mouse position. It's then saving it into this vector2 variable, which is then being multiplied by a sensitivity variable, after which it's being separated out into yaw and pitch rotations. The next two lines of code is where it's multiplying these variables to a camera rotation and a character rotation. And we can actually look at these variables, where up in the start function, we are getting the character's rotation based on the player character transform local rotation, or in other words, the local rotation of the first person controller prefab. And the rotation camera is being set to this local transform, which is that first child object of the prefab, or the default root. And the next section of code inside the late update function handles some smoothing and rotates the actual first-person controller prefab on the y-axis, after which it rotates the child or root or camera pivot object on the x-axis. And so now that I understand how this current look control is actually working, I can modify the code to make it behave the way I want it to behave. And all I really have to do is remove the separation between the two different rotations and apply both rotations to the main prefab object. Alright, and here it is. Now the first thing that I did was scroll up to the top and I commented out the rotation camera variable. This helped me identify everywhere in the code it was trying to rotate the camera and not the prefab. And the first instance of this variable was within the start function, where we were getting the local rotation of the camera pivot. And so I just commented out this line. Then within the late update function, the first two lines I kept the same. And then I combined the next two lines where the code was separating out the yaw and pitch. So I changed this first variable to just be rotation. And I moved this negative frame input.y from the second line to the first line. And then I commented out the second line. On the next line of code, I just had to change this variable to be the whole rotation instead of rotation yaw, and we're multiplying it to the rotation character variable. I then commented out the second line. I also commented out where we were getting the local rotation for the local pivot. And then inside this if statement where the code is handling the smooth, I commented out the first line of code because that's dealing with local rotation and rotation camera. And in the else statement, I did the same. And finally, I commented out this last line of code where it was setting the local rotation. With all these changes to the code, I can now save it and go back to Unity. You can see when I move right to left, it looks the same. But if I move my mouse up and down, it now rotates the whole player prefab. And I can move around in all directions. But there is still one issue, and that is the player's pivot, or where it's rotating the player object, is down by their feet, and that just doesn't look natural. So to fix this, I'm going to go into the player prefab. I'm going to move the capsule collider's center point to 0, and I'm going to move the default root object down in the y-axis by 1. Now if I save this prefab and I move the player object up in the scene and hit play, you can see now that when I rotate the first-person controller, it now rotates it more on its center of mass. And I could actually probably move it down a little bit more. Now that's everything I'm going to cover in this video, where I was able to customize the look input controls for my first-person controller. Now if you like this video, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and subscribe to my channel so you can be up to date whenever I publish new videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.